I've been inventing languages for a while now. The first time was right before college. I read an article that said that creating my own shorthand would be useful during lectures. I think the idea here was that if you could write quickly, you can get down more information during the lecture. That article seemed to suggest that having more information at the tips of your fingers made it more likely that you would actually learn it. Eventually, I learned that this isn't exactly the case. Having more information at your fingertips doesn't guarantee that you're actually going to engage with the material. But in the process of creating my own shorthand, I developed an entire orthography. If I remember correctly, an orthography is the way that you write stuff. And looking more into phonemic orthographies, it was actually kind of cool to explore the world around me. And I started to explore more about how symbols could be used to store information. Into and through college, I had been doing web development, sometimes as a job or internship, and mostly as a hobby. Though I guess it was kind of difficult for me to distinguish things that I did for a hobby versus towards an abstract career. As you see me going through this pile of art and interface, you might notice fragments of my career described in the background. Not the part about conspiracy, thankfully, that was generated by ChatGPT to tell the story of Emosha. And I'll probably write more of that story on my own in Loreland. But I'm talking about the stuff at the bottom: community economic development, customer relationship management, app suite, musician, travel agency, and the stuff on the side: the 1,000 employees and 5 million customers, 30 years, and I think $200 million is at the top of that one. I appreciate being able to reflect on my career as a software engineer and the visions that people have asked me to help them bring to life. And as I explore this more with story building and a relationship with artificial intelligence and human art, where I can use my human art to tell a new story that someone might have generated and understand that my relationship to my own art is different than theirs. As I continue making art, I'm going to reflect on my own experiences working with all of these different people. Something that I didn't really appreciate before I had spent a while in technology is how different every person's perspective on technology truly is. A big part of this is that some people just don't want to relate to technology. In college, I was pursuing electrical engineering and then learning and education studies. So entering a career as a software engineer was pretty natural to me because I had a background in engineering and learning new things, which both turn out to be pretty uncommon when talking about how people want to interact with the web. A lot of people don't really want to interact with interfaces that they aren't already familiar with. And that feels like it's pretty easy to say, but really making that meaningful, a lot of people don't want to interact with interfaces that they don't already have experience with, regardless of where they're coming from, I think is the important part to that. Because we don't really know how experienced our end users are. We don't have the ability to look into their minds and understand which interfaces they're contextualizing your experience with. So something that seems obvious or intuitive to me as a person who has intentionally explored engineering and education wouldn't necessarily be obvious to a person who doesn't want to explore those spaces at all. And with that comes an entire world that hasn't really been explored by most people who have implemented interfaces on the internet. Accessibility is often an afterthought in our society. And when we bring up the topic of accessibility, a lot of times that conversation is pre-contextualized with reasons why it might be difficult to implement. In college, the cognitive psychology courses that I took were very helpful in describing what stands out to people, and some of the patterns that our brains might recognize or persist as we encounter new stimuli. For example, as I'm going through this, I'm not really making any attempt to do things on a beat. If I were more intentional about my rhythm, then you might be more likely to notice the things that I bring up on the beat, simply because the rhymes are easier for us to remember. And this is something that is pretty fundamental to the ways that we interact with the world. As our worlds get more complex, we notice different sub-rhythms to the things that we interact with. From there, we form expectations based on how we think the rhythm should go and dance accordingly. So a big part of accessibility is just figuring out which rhythms people are dancing to. This is why I want to be very mindful about the ways that I produce content, because I don't really want to incentivize behavior that's different than what somebody would naturally do on their own. And sometimes making certain patterns easy to engage with disincentivizes people from exploring the meaning behind them. So while I can give tips about physical or digital media, I don't necessarily want to make all of my tips seem like they're entirely comprehensive. because that's how we get a whole bunch of people flooding the world with low-quality content. But I will be covering the topic more, so follow if you're interested. I talk about development and design on the web. Cheers!